Good afternoon, everybody. Susan Gillis here, Boca Raton Historical Society and Museum. Welcome to our virtual lecture series, Boca History 101. Are we on, Patricia?
Yep.
We have muted your microphone. Please don't unmute and don't join with video because we are recording this session, and we're going to provide a link to the recording to everyone who has signed up for our series. Today, we will be talking about Boca Raton during World War II, Part 3. Now, last time when I left off, I was talking about how important entertainment and recreation was in the operations of a huge air base like Boca Raton Field. So key to that, of course, is music. And you see here on the right a picture of our Boca Raton Army Airfield Band, which is very, very large. It was founded by a group of professional Miami musicians. And the captain, Captain Schrago, had a pilot's license and reportedly flew from airfield to airfield, recruiting virtuosi performers for his band. And that's how it got to be so big and renowned. Now, in her book, Small Town, Big Secrets, Sally Ling mentioned that the band was not segregated. However, I have never seen a picture of a Black musician in our Boca Raton Field Band, but we know there were certainly African-American performers, professional performers, stationed at the base. The group to the left, they call themselves the Boca Rhythm Boys. Now, music is that arena where now, as then, color lines are often blurred. So the white jazz musicians would play at the colored USO in Delray Beach, and vice versa. The Black musicians would play at the White Servicemen Center in various places. The band, of course, marched in many parades in West Palm, Fort Lauderdale, Delray, Hollywood, in Miami, and in the Orange Bowl on many occasions. They would perform daily at the base, perform all sorts of special concerts and entertainments. And you know that for the townsfolk of Boca Raton, this is probably the finest in-person performers finest live performances they had ever heard. So this was an enjoyable part of having a large military base in your hometown. We know because of the base newspaper, the Transmitter, that we had a number of professional entertainers stationed at Boca Raton Field. One is Mr. Benny Payne, who was Cap Calloway's pianist. So he was constantly performing for the soldiers at the base. Singer-actor Tony Martin, you may remember him for Strangers in Paradise in the 1950s. And Charlie Banks, who was a dancer who had danced with Fred Astaire and Josephine Baker. Here we have Mr. USO himself, Bob Hope, and the sweetheart of the USO, Frances Langford, actually performing at Boca Raton Field during the war. I don't know where they found the trees, but they're performing under the trees. There were a lot of wonderful entertainments at the Officers Club on the base. Young women, and probably not that young of a women, would get on the bus at the Fort Lauderdale Servicemen Center or the Delray Servicemen Center and come to soirees and buffets and various entertainments at the Officers Club. And a good time was had by all, as in the first Wing Ding held January 21st at 1943. Check out the interior decorating there. That's what I'm impressed by, with that oh-so-40s, what we would call retro now look, with the eyelash fringe on the furniture. That impresses me. Now, the enlisted men had a service center as well. It was a large wooden building on 4th Diagonal. Some of you may remember it from the Bibletown days as Moody Hall. And it was quite a large building, so there was a soda fountain where you could get a hamburger, probably pool tables, ping pong tables, card room, a library, and a very large dance floor and place for a live band. So many wonderful entertainments went on there. This is a formal dance held Christmas Eve of 1942. There were a number of chapels on the base with ecumenical services. And of course, at Easter, Christmas, and Thanksgiving, there would be base-wide services held in this amphitheater, to which the locals no doubt were invited, with performances by the band, as you can see, and the choir. We do know there was at least one Jewish rabbi associated with the base, and there were Jewish services for our many Jewish servicemen stationed at the field from 42 to 47. Just wanted to mention the base newspaper. It was called the Transmitter, and it was like a real newspaper. So that means there were reporters, an editor, and a print shop to produce the Transmitter. We have 7 copies in our collection. It was a weekly paper, but we only have 7 copies. Most of these were donated by veterans or their families. And actually 2 we tracked down from a collection at the Wisconsin Historical Society of all places. Somebody had collected newspapers of all sorts, and we were able to get microfilm copies of those. But they're wonderful resources because this is where you actually find information on specific enlisted men. And we have digitized these papers. If anybody ever comes across another one, please let me know. Wonderful resources about daily life at the base and the soldiers stationed there. Well, a lot of romances, as you might imagine, happened during the war years associated with Boca Raton Field. So I wanted to mention a couple of my favorite love stories. Private Archie Carswell, who we met earlier from Cairo, Georgia, was stationed at the field 42-43. And according to Archie, his barracks mate says, you know, I have a cousin living in Pearl City. Let's go visit him, her. I don't remember what sex that person was. And Pearl City wasn't too far away, and there, you know, not a whole lot to do. Archie says, sure. So they walk over to Pearl City, and they end up in the Demery household. Now, the Demerys are what my one of our Fort Lauderdale pioneers called a real pioneer. That means goes way back. And of course, everybody was related to the Demerys because it's a small town. Irene Demery happened to be sick and in bed. So this little group says, hey, let's go down the street to the Duke Joint or something like that. And according to Archie, Irene got up out of bed and was sick no more. That's Archie's version of events. They were married over 65 years. They never had children of their own, but of course they adopted everybody in the community. They were quite the activists. They were both deacons in their church at Ebenezer Baptist. And Archie was one of the first members of the Community Relations Committee back in the 70s or 80s, which was an interracial committee. He was a member of NAACP, a real activist very early on. And they, both of them, were stationed at the base because Irene worked at the PX on the base and provided wonderful photographs and memories for us, which I've got to tell you, it's quite a rare thing to have the perspective of African Americans at our World War II military base. So this is particularly important to us, great treasures that they shared with us. We buried them a few years ago. We miss them greatly. They were part of our Boca Raton Airfield Preservation Committee. Another couple includes Mr. Lieutenant Manny Chavez of Las Cruces, New Mexico, who met Lieutenant Bernice Butler, who had recently graduated from the University of Tennessee Nursing School. They were married in the base chapel, and they had a baby in the base hospital. And they too provided many wonderful photographs and memories for us. Both of them are gone as well. Manny was career Air Force, so he had a lot of good stories after the war as well. And their daughter, who is a friend of ours, still lives in Miami. A lot of families had to relocate, particularly the families of radar instructors, of which there were many. Typical of this is Phoebe and Bill Ettinger. Bill was a radar instructor, and they lived with their little daughter, Patty, initially in Fort Lauderdale, because that was as close as they could get, but eventually they moved to the Palmetto Park project, which we'll talk about in a minute, and Boca Raton became their permanent home. Bill managed the water treatment plant in Boca Raton. Pat, who we know as Pat Ettinger Jakubic, was my volunteer and actually my research assistant for a number of years. She has since passed, and we miss her dreadfully. So where to live is a real issue because you have families of soldiers, particularly officers, as well as civilians working at the base. And Boca's a little tiny town. There's not a lot of places to live in town. So people were boarding at boarding houses and living in motels and inns from as far away as Boynton, all the way down to Fort Lauderdale. And of course, ours was not the only military base around. They're all over the place. So housing's a real issue during these years. Now, it was your patriotic duty if you had a room to open your house to boarders. And not only that, that was, financially lucrative. Typical of this is Miss Lillian Williams. She owned the little house we call Singing Pines, which today is a children's museum. And this was when it was still located at its original site, which was on Southwest 1st Avenue. So that's the west side of the Florida East Coast tracks, about 3 blocks south of Palmetto Park Road. Her mom, who is pictured seated in the photograph, lived with her, as did all these young women in that little tiny house. And what they did was people would put cardboard up to have some semblance of privacy. Lillian lived on the back patio and lived on a cot. Cooked for everybody on a little kerosene stove, and it made do. She even had Lillian even had 2 families living in her hen house. So this was financially advantageous, but very, very squishy, let's say. Now, in reaction to this, the Federal Housing Authority actually constructed 2 housing projects during the war right here in Boca Raton. The first is the Palmetto Park project, which was, as you can see, south of what is today City Hall, so south of Palmetto Park Road. And the locals at the time, they called it the project. This was for white citizens only. And they looked like barracks, and a lot of people remember them as barracks, but they were not. They were actually just very prosaic apartment houses. They were concrete block. After the war, they were renovated in the 50s as the garden apartments, and some of you may remember that, which were demolished in 1971. The inset photo shows the project in the either 47 or 48 flood. There was also a housing project for African-American citizens, initially called Dixie Plaza, also known as the project during the war. And this was located east of Dixie Highway and north of what is today Glades, later known as Dixie Manor. Now, it still exists. After the war, it came into private hands, got a bit derelict. In 80 or so, the city acquired it, turned it over to the Housing Authority, and it was renovated with additional buildings added. And so it still exists. Many civilians worked at the base, maybe 1,000. Eldra Durham and her husband Richard were postal clerks in Fort Lauderdale, and they were transferred basically to Boca Raton Field. They worked 12-hour shifts, and I know they commuted, which made for quite a long day, and eventually were able to get an apartment, probably at the Palmetto Park project, because she remembers her address was Palmetto Park Road. Also, we can see, I believe the ladies who are in the white uniforms are probably civilian employees at one of the mess halls. So this was a pretty good job during the war. This is an intriguing photograph. It's an official military photograph. And this is an unidentified female civilian instructor teaching what I am told is radio electronics at a room at the hotel. So there's a very, very good story here, and we will never know what it is. The Red Cross was very important during these years. We had loads of officers' wives who are bored out of their ever-loving board. No television, no internet. And they, and men as well, become very involved with the Red Cross. Not only do they learn bandaging techniques, and notice this poor lady is getting her high heel bandage in this facetious photograph, knitting things like socks, but the Red Cross was a true welfare agency during the war. And so you had a lot of enlisted men and young with new families in tow, new babies, and their salaries just not going very far. So the Red Cross provides goods, services, and money to help them out. And in order to raise money for the Red Cross, our officers' wives would get together and hold all sorts of fundraisers, fancy luncheons, bake sales, entertainment, and so on. And that kept them quite busy. Peace breaks out in 1945, but the base is still occupied until 1947. In September of that year, there was a terrible Category 4 hurricane hit Fort Lauderdale and did a real number on Boca Raton. And many of the wooden buildings of the base came down like dominoes. Now, I like to mention here that at that time and in previous years, 44 and 45, we had sort of near-miss hurricanes, that the base personnel took refuge at the Boca Raton Club. So personnel were safe. That's the largest building with masonry and so on. But obviously the base took a serious hit. Now, before this, there had been some talk about Boca Raton Field becoming a permanent military installation, which would have been, you know, a wonderful boon to the local economy. But they had already made that decision. No, that was not to be. So here's the damage of the base. I like to mention everybody in town, all the townies with a camera went out and took these same photographs, hundreds of photographs of the same things. And in later years, they donated them to our collection, and I had to catalog them. So by October 47, most personnel and most operations are being transferred to Keesler Field in Biloxi. Most, but not all. Because by 47, the U.S. Army Air Force has morphed into the United States Air Force, a separate agency. Boca Raton becomes the Boca Raton Auxiliary Air Force Base with much smaller acreage, 838 acres. How many personnel? I don't know how many servicemen were there, but enough to field a softball team, because here they are. Fascinatingly, in the mid-50s, there was a another secret government experiment going on that probably involved the Auxiliary Air Force Base, but took place on a site just north of what is campus today on former base lands. And under cover of darkness, about 100 people working there were growing wheat and researching a wheat fungus known as stem rust of rye on 85 acres of the former field. And the idea was that this fungus would be broadcast onto Soviet wheat fields, which, as far as we know, didn't happen. All the vehicles were painted black. It was very hush-hush. Boca Raton was chosen because we don't grow wheat in this part of the world. So if the fungus happened to get into the environment, it wouldn't do any damage. So very interesting time about which we would love to know more. Our city, after the war, is able to acquire a lot of the former base lands to, in turn, sell as war surplus, land and buildings. But the former runways of the base, they used to lure the newest state university, which we call Florida Atlantic University, to town in the late 50s, about 60. We won over Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale was in competition. And I've got to tell you, it really took some serious politicking, because remember, Boca Raton was still a pretty small town. A lot of it is thanks to Tom Fleming, a very important member of our community. So FAU is due to open the day Hurricane Cleo struck in October '64. That was an inauspicious start. And the initial enrollment was quite disappointing. When it began, FAU was a 2-year university, juniors and seniors, because there were new community colleges, we called them junior colleges back then, springing up all over the state of Florida, mostly on former airbase lands, old airports and so on, that served freshmen and sophomore. And the idea was that you would transfer to a university like FAU. Well, of course, all has passed. All has changed in ensuing years. We have well over 30,000 students. We have multiple campuses, and you cannot underestimate the impact Florida Atlantic University as an entity has made it and all of its people on the history of our community, much the same as the air base did before it. Part of the agreement with the government to get that land was that Boca would maintain an airport. Initially it was, the thought is that we might have military planes here. Remember, it was the Cold War. So here we have an aerial of our airport, which is on one of the former runways of the base in 1988 versus 2020. So it has grown just a bit. Shout out to our airport and your important heritage. Typical of the people taking advantage of the war surplus is Mr. Eshelman. He was an evangelist, and he established a Christian resort community west of the City Hall site, in the vicinity of 4th Avenue, north of Palmetto Park Road, on former baselands, Bible Conference Grounds, or Bible Town is what it was called. Initially, there was a very large old wooden auditorium, which at the time was the only auditorium in town. So a lot of concerts took place there, to which the general public was invited. Even a movie theater, big old wooden movie theater. And this building, known as Moody Hall in the Bibletown era. Now, that had been the enlisted men's center that I showed you earlier. Bibletown exists today as the Boca Raton Community Church. Many of the H buildings, and we call them that just because they have that profile from the air, were concrete block, and after the war, they became commercial, industrial sorts of businesses. Most of them became apartment houses. One of the most important was the headquarters building for the base, which stood at 101 Pine Circle. After the war, it was known as Boca Heights Apartments, not particularly glamorous. It was very prosaic. And the Boca Historical Society met with the last owner of the building, who was planned to demolish it. We actually hired a preservation architect and preservation contractor to meet with this person and his contractor to try and convince him to either sell the building or maybe redevelop it as loft style apartments. As I say, it wasn't pretty, but it had very cool features like exposed Dade County pine rafters, Gate City windows from Fort Lauderdale from the war, a lot of concrete, real industrial vibe going on. However, we could not convince him, and the building was demolished in 2013, and the lot stands empty. We were able to salvage the door to the vault, which was a very large room. Obviously, a lot of important secrets were stored there. Another interesting building was T3, a huge wooden building on the research and development portion of FAU's campus. So that's the northeast corner as you're heading off of campus. And it was restored in 2006 by HRM4 LLC, Tom Head, Jim Rosemurthy et al. And it was magnificent inside. These Dade County pine rafters, clerestory windows, this huge space. And what they were going to do is subdivide it as needed for commercial industrial uses. Well, before the building was officially open, they allowed us to have a fundraiser for the Boca Raton Army Airfield Preservation Committee. And it was a 2-day event. We had swing dancers. We had World War II food like Spam and egg salad. We had exhibits. We had an honor guard. And a number of veterans who were stationed at the base showed up. Very touching, very sentimental, a wonderful event. And a week later, it was struck by lightning and burned to a complete crispy critter. And of course, we feared arson, but we were assured by the fire marshal that no, Dade County pine, it just burns like crazy because it's full of this sap that makes it very hard wood as it ages. And it was just bad timing. But frankly, I have not recovered from these 2 blows to historic preservation in our community. This is what those H buildings look like during the war, very prosaic. Those are ventilator shafts, I think, coming out of the roof. And what they look like now, most of them are well disguised. They have additions on the front and the doors are moved around and so on. But the good thing is we have very detailed wartime maps and very detailed wartime aerial photographs, very high resolution, which we can use to compare prospective war buildings, wartime buildings, to Google Earth satellite view. So that's the advantage of modern technology. And it's pretty clear when you look straight down if something has this H-shaped building and you suspect it's, an old Boca Raton airfield building. It's pretty clear which ones are and which one are not. There are 4 buildings that survive on campus at FAU. There used to be a lot more. They're known as T buildings also. T6, T5, T10, and 11. This is north of Henderson School. T6 and 5 are just rectangles. They were school buildings as well. They have a lot of original features. Again, they ain't glamorous. Gate City awning style windows made in Fort Lauderdale. Gate City made windows for military bases all over the world during World War II. And they're those old crank style awning windows, but the frames are wooden instead of aluminum like I had in my house. Many of the doors are original. We actually had a preservation architect do some measurements and examination and drawings of these buildings for us to assess what was original, what is not. And of course, those chimneys, those are incinerator stacks. So you always have your top secret elements going on there. And you can see below an air view from the wartime. We made friends with Mr. Art Jaffe, who is the origins of the Jaffe book arts collection at our library. Now, Mr. Jaffe is gone now, he has passed, but he was a World War II veteran and he was part of our Boca Raton Field Preservation Committee. And so the collection needed a place to have a paper making lab, an art lab. So they set up in T6 almost 10 years ago, as you can see. And we were invited, and they had a World War II theme, which was quite a hoot. But you can see a lot of the original features still exist. When you look down the hallway, if you can imagine the transoms above the door being open, because no air conditioning back then, it looks pretty much like it did during the war. Even we found that even the lavatory, at least in the women's room, is definitely wartime. The other two buildings, 10 and 11, are L-shaped. They were bachelor officers' quarters during the war, and they have a lot more changes. They're much less original in their features. We think the windows have been replaced, doors, and so on, but they still stand. Now, there's a persistent myth in town, particularly amongst the students, that there are tunnels from World War II under FAU. And I'm afraid this is not true, much as it sounds like a good idea. In fact, there are tunnels under FAU, but they are maintenance engineering tunnels. And here's a picture of one from 1965. There is one last little bit of the airfield left at FAU, north of Palm Beach College, right off FAU Boulevard as you're heading north off campus, is this funny section of concrete that's obviously wartime. And it was an apron, that's where you park the planes. And somehow it has managed to avoid the bulldozer. I'm sure it's just a matter of time. And it has slots in the ground and rails, as you can see, for some kind of car, like a coal car, probably to service the planes. Many years ago, 10 years ago, Florida Atlantic University actually offered to the Boca Raton Field Preservation Committee and the Historical Society a space and T6 for an exhibition area on the field and on World War II. And we actually engaged the services of an exhibit designer to do some planning for us. And this was a wonderful idea. I had in mind that we would get the history department students to come over and clean up our space and paint it, and then we would work on the exhibit. However, long story short, because of liability issues, we were told we would have to use FAU approved contractors, and based on the cost to renovate the paper lab, our estimated cost for our little space was going to be $70,000. And we had in mind $7,000. So this project has been put on, shall we say, long-term hold. It's still a good idea, but instead we've been putting our money towards renovating our town hall and providing a gallery dedicated to World War II in our History Alive exhibit. And here you can see this is a draft, a rendering of that space. So you can look forward to that in the near future. This is the little fun postscript. These are landmarks which purport to be World War II, but they're not. One was this really large satellite dish in what is today Red Reef Park. It is not wartime. It was constructed in about 52. And I know this because I found the city correspondence on it. And it's very unclear to me who built the tower or who was in charge or what it was for. So you can read into it what you want, because remember the times. By the 70s, it was replaced with a smaller dish and a metal tower, and that was removed in 72 or so, 73. And that's my buddy Mark Selleck. Shout out to Mark. The tower was, of course, a landmark for divers back in the day. There are also these concrete pedestals on the grounds of the Art Museum Art School that used to be the Art Museum. There are 4 on the west side and 1 or 2 on the east side of the lawn there on Palmetto Park Road. And the story is that they were bases of radar towers from the war, but that's not so, because this was that part. Remember, Floresta and the art school were not part of the base. That was off the base. So I don't think you would have had radar towers, top secret radar towers, off campus at that particular time. Instead, they are the base of radio towers from station WFLA, I kid you not, broadcasting Meisner Development Corporation ads in 1926-27. That's much more amusing, in my opinion. Here are some resources we want to recommend for you. Small Town Big Secrets by our friend Sally Lang is about the history of the field and Boca Raton during World War II. That's available in our Fire Bay gift shop. As is Palm Beach County during World War II, which is a photographic history. Half the book is about Boca. Not only is there a chapter on Boca Raton Field, but there are Boca photos under entertainment, civilian life, so on and so on. I did this in conjunction with our buddies at the Historical Society of Palm Beach County. We had a blast doing it. And it's an easy way to learn about wartime in Palm Beach County. And of course, that's at our gift shop. War in Paradise is by our friend Elliot Kleinberg, longtime Palm Beach Post reporter and local historian. There's a really good chapter on the Operation Drumbeat and the submarine attacks during the war, and many other interesting things. And Tustanegee is the Historical Society of Palm Beach County's journal, which is online. The 2012 issue features an article on the end of the Yamato colony and also Boca Raton Field. And of course, you check out our website at bocahistory.org, pull down the research tab, Our History. There's a page about Boca Raton Field with lots of links to more information on World War II, including some fairly new Spanish River papers with primary resources, for example, wartime letters and so on. So plenty more to be learned on that subject. Well, this concludes our talk on World War II and Boca Raton. And this, alas, is the end of our Boca History 101 lecture series. I want to thank you so much for joining us. And if you're not a member, please become one. Tell all your friends to become a member. And we really appreciate if you would support us by befriending us on Facebook, following us on Twitter, Instagram, joining our YouTube channel. We really need the numbers for our grants, and we want to spread our outreach. So we keep in tune, because very soon we will be completing our History Alive exhibits, opening up again, and we look forward to seeing you. If you have any topics or speakers relevant to Greater Boca Raton history, local history, that you would like to hear as a virtual lecture, let us know. Go ahead and email research@bocahistory.org. We're be really interested in hearing what you have to say on this subject. Thank you so much.